The years immediately after the Cold War was won were full of triumphant declarations of a democratizing world, of former Soviet republics transitioning to liberal values and institutions. Eastern Europe, in particular, became the great test kitchen for the West's vision of democracy. As you know, it hasn't really turned out as planned. Stephen Holmes is co-author with Ivan Krastyev of The Light That Failed, A Reckoning, which won this year's Lionel Gelber Prize for Best English Language Nonfiction Book on Foreign Affairs. Professor Holmes is at New York University School of Law, and he joins us now from his home in the West Village on Manhattan Island. Congratulations on your Gelber Prize, and how are you managing through this pandemic?
Well, it's a strange time, but those of us who were able to travel so easily around the world find it actually relatively easy to stay at home. It's a strange feeling, particularly when so many people out there on whom we depend are suffering and having to endure a lot of difficulties. It's a privileged place, as you probably know too. Those of us who can work from home, who are able to. It's a horrible thing to say, but to distribute danger to others. And it makes for psychologically not that easy, but of course physically comfortable.
Well, we're glad to hear that on your behalf, and we're glad you could join us tonight. I want to just start with the title of your book, The Light That Failed. What is the light you refer to in that title?
Well, this is a play, of course, on the God that failed, which was the communist ideology that former communists were disappointed in its results for good reasons. And in this case, it's not so much that liberalism has failed, although liberal democracy is clearly is besieged. It is on its back heels. It has a lot of, has rivals now that are making it struggle. But what has failed is the promise after 1989 that liberal democracy would be a model for the world. And that idea, I think, for a variety of reasons, which we can discuss, has now been thrown into the dust heap of history.
And you're defining liberal democracy or liberalism how?
Well, this is a complicated story, but certainly what the book Light That Failed with my brilliant colleague Ivan Krastev is about the promise of 1989. So in 1989, there was a feeling, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, but more broadly in the world, that the end of communism meant that there was one remaining model for political and economic development, and that was the West, whether that's the European Union or the United States. In any case, liberalism was not something, just an abstract ideology, but it was the way Western societies organized themselves. And that was thought of as an ideal, not just an ideal, but it was the way post-communist societies were going to develop. They were going to model themselves upon their idea of the Western capitalist democracy.
Well, the way you describe it is a struggle for normalcy. What do you mean by normalcy, and what's the significance of that?
So most of the prominent intellectuals in Poland and Hungary, such as Adam Michnik or Václav Havel, said, we are tired of experiments. Communism was an experiment. We want a society that's a normal society, by which they didn't mean Poland before World War II or the old Czechoslovakia. What they meant was the West. They wanted to no longer engage in experiments. And we wanted to imitate the Western society. And of course, if you think about that for 1 minute, you realize there's something delusional, there's an illusion there, because if you try to transfer a fully worked out model from one society to another in a place that it has never existed, you're going to be undergoing an experiment, and things are going to happen that you don't expect and that are perhaps not welcome. And that is what we saw. We didn't predict, we didn't understand the consequences of trying to imitate Western style political and economic systems in post-communist society. And part of our quest in this book is to understand how we went from the promise of 1989, the promise of liberal democracy in Central and Eastern Europe, to, in particular, Hungary and Poland turning into hotbeds of illiberal, xenophobic, nativist populism, anti-liberal populism, authoritarianism. How did that happen? From where, what was the source of the disappointment in liberalism that led to this development?
Well, let's go back more than 30 years to actually one particular date on the calendar. I want to go to June 4th, 1989. Two significant political events happening on that day. In Poland, the first sort of normal democratic election in a communist country took place. And of course, in China, there was the massacre in Tiananmen Square. How do you see the historical significance, perhaps together, of these two very divergent events?
I mean, it's amazing you put them together. Of course, we mentioned it in the book, but in a way, in the Western perspective at that time was what was happening in China was something of a backwater. It wasn't really defining the change of the trajectory of world history. Of course, it did do that, as we know, looking in retrospect. And the events in Poland seem much more prescient or pregnant with the future, because, of course, well, interestingly enough, the Tiananmen events, the crackdown in Tiananmen was a crackdown on an attempt by Chinese students and Chinese workers to liberalize the society. They even built a copy of the Statue of Liberty in Tiananmen Square. And the leadership in China crushed that revolt because they viewed it as an exhibit of Americanization and a kind of betrayal of what China really needed to be, and of course, a challenge to their authority. That was a backsliding or a failure of liberal democracy to spread, but it was not viewed as defining the era. While what happened in Poland was, and there was a sense that this is an opening, and that this opening is going to develop and is going to define the next generations. It was a development that presaged the spread of liberal democracy around the world as the one available, possible, promising model. I mean, just a point of background here that during the Cold War, you had two systems, both children of the Enlightenment, that were creating replica regimes. West Germany is the most famous example for the West, creating a regime that's replicating liberal democracy. And in 89, 91, the communist rival, the other system that was creating replica regimes collapsed and gave up on its claim to the future. There was one regime left, that was the Western, and particularly led by America. And so what happened in 89, 91 was that, to put it crudely, one way to put it is to say that America or the West fell in love with itself, lost its sense of self-criticism, and decided that it was the culmination of Western history. And this particularly American self-love, met a desire on the part of post-communist elites to they wanted to become normal. They desired this. It wasn't Westernization wasn't imposed by military power in Eastern Europe. It was accepted voluntarily. It became, with time, resented for good reasons, which we discussed. But at the beginning, it was voluntary. Then, in the thesis of the book, we were asking, why is it that democratization produced a politics of grievance and resistance and resentment? And the simplest answer is that democratization was imitation, and imitation is associated with the confession that the other is superior, you're inferior, and of course that produces resentment. But more particularly, if I could give you just one, I think, very revealing example of how this developed. Let's take Hungary as an example. The Hungarians took standard model Thatcherite privatization, which developed in the West. They applied it in a society with no private capital. The consequence of this was, in a way, we should have seen it ahead of time, was that managers took the assets of their enterprises and used that to buy the enterprises for themselves, creating their own private wealth. And this was the beginning of the development of appalling inequalities in these in East European societies, post-communist societies, unjustifiable inequalities, which were resented. But not only that, the language of liberalism, which is the language of human rights, individual rights, was not able to capture or to articulate the grievance experienced by those who watched the public patrimony of their country, put into the pockets of individuals who were insiders. So the privatization of public patrimony was experienced as an abuse, as a crime, but it couldn't be articulated in the language of individual rights, of liberalism. And indeed, the language of liberalism, particularly the language of private property rights, began blessed or justified this process, which was widely viewed as illegitimate and unjustifiable, and of course, personally painful. If you are your best friend, you have two friends, they're very equal one day. Then in a couple of years, one of them is riding around in limousines. The other can't afford a bus ticket. One is eating at fish restaurants every night. The other can't afford a piece of fresh fruit. That produces resentment. So the Westernization process created traumas in these societies, which we didn't foresee and didn't predict, but that was the seedbed for this populist revolt against the liberal order.
Now, for those of us who grew up during the Cold War, this is going to sound passing strange, but there are many on the right in Eastern and Central Europe that consider the European Union to be the new Soviet Union. How can that be?
Yeah, this is a very strange development, interesting and kind of complicated. So the first thing is that reform elites in Eastern Europe were very eager to join in the accession process to the European Union, and therefore accepted the post-national rhetoric of the European Union that, if you remember, was really developed to help Germany overcome its nationalistic past. So it was a very post-national language, and that meant that these reform elites were leaving behind in their own country national symbols, national traditions. They kind of didn't speak about them. And therefore, when resentment or when the West entered into crisis, particularly in 2008, and the Western model seemed to be less than it was cracked up to be and to present problems, a counter elite emerged in Eastern Europe, in Central and Eastern Europe, mostly of provincial origins, who blamed everything that went wrong on the fact that the reform elite had abandoned the nation, had abandoned national traditions. So this was the accession process was viewed as a betrayal of national authenticity. In addition, there's another very interesting factor, which is that the European Union was asking Poland and Hungary to become democratic. You must learn how to become democracies like we in the West. At the same time, Brussels was saying, we are going to write all of your laws. So while you're becoming democratic, actually your laws are going to be written in Brussels. This produced also resentment and a feeling that there was something perverse or arrogant about Brussels. Now, obviously, Brussels is not Moscow. It doesn't have a boot on their throats, but it did convey a sense of superiority, judgmentalism. And I need to emphasize that although the West did not impose democracy and liberalization, it did judge the progress of democratization and liberalization. And in a way, Westerners, when they visited Eastern Europe, I saw this a lot. I worked there, of course, in the 90s. It was as if it's in the way tourists visit a zoo. You know, you go to the zoo, you look at the primates, you say, well, they're like us, but they're missing something. They don't have an opposable thumb, or they don't have the rule of law. So you're kind of saying you're kind of a copy of us, but you're not a very good copy, and probably you'll never be much good. So there was a feeling of being looked down upon, which also stirred resentment. And if I could just say one other thing about, I think authenticity, the sense these populists are claiming that they are those in touch with the authentic tradition, which has been lost by Westernization and democratization. So in 1989, it's clear that the nationalists were allied with the liberals in the revolt against Moscow's empire. So in Poland, there was a lot of basically trying to get away from Russia was a very important motivation. Now, they didn't speak the language of nationalism at the time, partly because it was not a language welcome in Brussels, but also because this was the period of Milosevic, you know, the bloody side of nationalism, and Milosevic was a communist, ex-communist. So a man like Kaczynski would never echo Milosevic. So there was the language of nationalism was subdued, and when after 2008, 2014, the immigration crisis, these populists in Eastern Europe felt freed from having to cover their nationalism with the language of liberalism. So it had felt like a kind of cage in which they were trapped, and they broke out of it and returned to this kind of nativist way of feeling, which had always been there, but had been muffled. So that's part of why populism seems authentic to them.
Well, let's extend your metaphor a little further. If we want to talk about the number one primate in the zoo, boy, this is a terrible analogy. Should we ask about Russia here? Why didn't I mean the many of the Central and Eastern European countries did sort of flirt with liberal democracy for a while before adopting illiberal democracy that they have today, but Russia never did. Why did Russia never try it?
Well, I mean, first of all, you have to remember that in the Soviet Union, elites had found it very easy to fake democracy, have fake elections, because they'd been faking communism for at least 2 decades before. They sort of dressed up this way. Let's pretend we're having to have elections. These are all rigged, of course, and we know who's going to win, and there's not really any competition. That was very easy for them to do. They also, in Russia, by the way, they had a communist training told them that democracy is just a trick by which elites deceive their publics and hold on to power. Capitalism is just really an elite project to exploit the working classes and so on. So they were very comfortable with that idea of capitalist democracy. But in the end, basically, Russia was so injured. I mean, the main thing to understand about the Russian situation is they lost a huge part of their territory, a huge number of their population. They lost their superpower status. It was a huge injury to the self-image of Russians, which was not true in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europeans didn't have this imperial swagger, this imperial claims that they were, on the top of the world, and actually exporting their own model elsewhere. So that was a very strong. And I think the Russians for a couple of decades were pretty happy with just faking democracy. But in the end, as Putin came to power, the resentment of being treated as second-class citizens, as being looked down upon, as being taught lessons by the West, boiled over. And the Russians went from this like faking a democracy to what we call aggressive imitation. That is imitation of the West, which is designed to humiliate the West, which is designed to show that the West is hypocritical. So, for example, in the speech Putin gave justifying the annexation of Crimea, he basically imitated word for word Western speeches about the independence of Kosovo, human rights, national self-determination, and so forth. But this was very much a kind of imitation meant to expose the West's hypocrisy. And yes, I think that's a good way to understand the Putin regime, which is not, people often act as if Putin is a great strategist. And it is true that he's played a poor hand well, but he's not a great strategist. His main aim, which is not strategic and is not helping Russia redevelop itself, is to expose the West as hypocritical. That's his obsession. And I think that's a blind alley. That's a dead end.
Maybe a blind alley, but most days of the week, it's not that hard to do. Whoops, there's my little editorial comment. Let me try this. Do we have to come to the unhappy conclusion, therefore, that liberalism, as we understand it, is really not exportable to cultures that are, if I can put it this way, wired differently from those of us in the West?
I think one of the big lessons of the 2003 war in Iraq is that trying to impose a democratic system after a 6-week military campaign in a country where 3/4 of the population marry their first cousin. And so it's a completely different social world. You can't just, impose something like this. And that was such a lesson, even though our internationalist, humanitarian internationalist elite went over there with the crude and I think defenseless idea that the only legitimate authority with whom we are going to deal are going to be authority that's elected. I think it's a very good help so the listeners to contrast how we behaved in Afghanistan and how the Americans behaved in Afghanistan and how they behaved in Iraq. In Afghanistan, we had been there for decades. We knew all the warlords. We didn't say to the warlords, you must be elected before we negotiate with you. But in Iraq, the religious leaders, the tribal sheikhs were set aside. we had this fake ideological belief that we have to create authority by elections, which of course is based on historical ignorance. Democracy is a tiny spot in human history. It has huge, enormously complicated preconditions. It doesn't. We're confusing the absence of obstacles with the presence of preconditions. We thought if you get rid of Saddam, you're going to have democracy. Just like if you get rid of communist elite, you're going to have democracy. And this was an illusion. It's a democratic ideology. That idea was exposes a kind of disgraceful historical ignorance, which was at the basis of much of American foreign policy in the post-Cold War era.
We've got about 5 minutes to go here, so let me try a couple of more questions with you. Your book now suggests that we've entered an age of illiberal imitation. How do you see that?
Well, it's a strange fact that President Trump seems to be accepting Putin's strategic goal of dismantling the European Union, of destroying all of the international organizations created by the United States after World War II. And he's at war not only with the WTO, the WHO, and all the world America made seems to be the liberal world order, seems to be something that Trump himself is attacking. So that is a kind of imitation of, and he's using the rhetoric, nationalist rhetoric, anti-immigrant rhetoric of Orban and Kaczynski, and the anti-Western language. And also, by the way, he's the first American president who has not said we deserve to rule the world because we're morally superior. I mean, that's a kind of not a very likable position to take, but every American president has taken that basically. And Trump says, no, we're just like everyone else.
What I case for him to make personally, don't you think?
Say it again?
Be a tough case for him personally to make,
yeah,
don't you think?
Imitating him personally, yes, I would say. But he, of course, his basic thing is he resents, this is sort of the Trump worldview, is he resents terribly the countries that imitate our economic productivity or horning in on our market share and so on. So he's a person who has claimed, I think the first American president ever, to say that America is the greatest victim of the Americanization of the world. So that's part of it. But I would like to say a word about the current crisis we're in. And I've been asking myself and my colleague, Ivan Krastev, we've been speaking about this as well. What was the current pandemic tell us about the trauma of liberalism and the competition between liberalism and populism? Because in a way, the previous crises of liberalism, 2001, in which it turned out that defending human rights, the whole idea of defending human rights as the primary value, seemed to give way to the battle against terrorism, in which rights were viewed as a Trojan horse for our enemies. 2008, which really showed that our economic elite didn't know what it was doing, so that also really hurt our prestige. 2014, in which the migrant crisis made people feel like open borders were a threat to Western civilization and so on. All these things have combined, and we're under we're living in a time where those three crises have seemed to be accumulating in the present one and weakening the liberal commitment to globalization and so forth, openness. At the same time, every political order has its own disorders, and populism is producing its own discontents. And these populist leaders, Bolsonaro, Trump, authoritarians like Putin, strangely enough, they are very afraid of this crisis. They are not, taking hold of it and using it to their benefit. There's a way in which this kind of crisis is challenging any kind of regime. Authoritarian regimes. We saw that in China, where they're hiding evidence. We see it in the West. Some democratic societies have done well. Some authoritarian societies have done okay. It doesn't seem to fit well into our ideological polarities. So I think and the way I would put this in the end, the question open to us is now in the future is the pandemic going to increase our reliance on science and rationality, belief in fact consciousness, or is it going to create is the panic and fear going to lead to more conspiracy theories and more xenophobia, migrant bashing. So we're on a knife's edge, I think, and the fate of the liberal model and the liberal commitment to rational decision making and its competition with these populist myth makers, sloganeers who are always trying to sell something has not been decided. I definitely do not think the populists have the upper hand. I think the populists are also struggling, and they're not finding this an easy crisis to deal with. So although I don't believe that the West is covering itself with glory either, and liberal regimes are also struggling because the disease is hard to understand and it's hard to master. I definitely don't believe that the current crisis is going to really decide the question in favor of the populists.
Well, why don't I freelance then and just retitle your book, The Light That's Failed So Far, and we'll leave it there. I want to thank you very much, Professor Holmes, for joining us on TVO tonight. Congratulations again on your Gelber Prize. For anybody who wants to pick it up, Ivan Krastyev and Stephen Holmes collaborated on The Light That Failed, A Reckoning. Take good care, and thanks for joining us on TVO tonight.
Thank you, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.